time. It's been a while since I've been up here. In fact, it was 2019, I do believe December of 2019, the last time I actually preached out of James. But if my math is right, and since I'm going to be doing this every week, we should actually finish James in about a month and a half. So, now that my math also, when I started James, said that I should be able to finish it in just a couple months, and 2 years later we're still here. So we'll see how that works out. But since it's been such a long time since we've started James, I'd like to kind of go back and review James real quick, just to see where we came from and where it's leading us into for chapter 4. Which is why it says review. So we start off with James being a letter to all of the Israelites who have been spread out across the Roman Empire and across the known world. This is a letter to all of them. It's a letter partially in response to what people think about Paul and what his teachings were. It does come up as a counter to just grace being for salvation. Obviously, grace is all that's needed for salvation, but without faith, that grace is dead. And we see that a little bit later on. He starts off with joy, counting it joy when we experience various trials and tribulations. In that time, it was trials and tribulations and persecution for our faith. Nowadays, it's trials and tribulations in being able to even meet and facing this disease and wearing masks and having to deal with standing farther apart from people and wearing a mask and being uncomfortable. You know, that is a trial, but we can count it joy that, hey, we can still meet. And through this trial, he's going to perfect us, which is James's next point. He also says one of the few guaranteed promises in the Bible. If we lack wisdom, ask, and will receive wisdom. Now that promise isn't a immediate, if I ask, I immediately become wise. It's we continue to ask and he continues to give us. And he also qualifies that with, we need to ask in faith. Ask expecting to receive. Otherwise, we can't expect to receive anything. James spends a lot of time talking about rich and poor, and that just like Jesus said, it is more difficult for a rich person than it is for a poor person because they rely on the world a lot more. We're actually going to be getting into that next week. And relying on the world. In fact, one of the verses next week is, did you not know that to be a friend of the world is to have enmity, to be an enemy of God? It's so much more difficult when you're wealthy and you can provide for all of your own needs. And so James reminds the wealthy and reminds the poor, why are you trying to be friends with the wealthy when they're the ones who persecute you and keep you down? He also reminds us not to be deceived that every good gift and perfect gift comes from above. He then, I think one of the great promises in James that I always remember, and always kind of kicks me in the backside, is that we should all be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And that to be doers and not hearers, you deceive yourselves. But also, if we think that we're religious and don't guard our tongue, we deceive our heart, because our religion is worthless. I enjoy talking. It's a gift, but it's also a curse. Elsewhere in the Bible it says that we will be judged for every idle word that we speak. I've got a lot of idle words to be held accountable for. But I know that my God is a gracious God. But these are promises and these are warnings to us from James. Later he does get into faith without works is dead, with one of his great examples of, I will show you my salvation, my faith, by my works. Look at the things that I'm doing, which will show you the faith that I have. And how are you going to show me your faith without works? James never says that salvation is needed from works. But what he does say is that works shows the proof of that faith, that saving faith. And we see that many times throughout the world in missionaries and martyrs and other people who go into dangerous situations not thinking about their own life, but only thinking about the mission. Their faith is a saving faith. And then he goes back on to taming the tongue. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. It reminds us about gossiping and spreading rumors and just letting our words do their own work. How deadly that can be. Which again is a good reminder for me. And then we have a key, almost central portion of James, which is who is wise and understanding among you. By his good conduct let him show his works, in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast and be false to the truth. That is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. We can almost take all of James, that's in the end of chapter 3. We can almost take all of James and look at every little bit of it and view it as earthly wisdom or godly wisdom. Earthly wisdom is to complain about every trial that we see. Godly wisdom is to look forward and go, what's God doing through me in this trial? Earthly wisdom is to spread gossip and belittle those around you so you can be raised. Whereas godly wisdom is to build up those around you and who are hurting. We have earthly and godly wisdom. And then we get to our passage today, chapter 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? I can actually give us the verse. Oh, actually, before we get there. I found this quote actually when I was looking at everything, and I thought it really does sum up what we're going to be talking about. And it gives us something to think about as we're going through all of this. This is from Stephen Brown. He said, it was F.B. Meyer, I believe, who once said that when we see a brother or sister in sin, there are two things that we do not know. First, we don't know how hard he or she has tried not to sin. And second, we don't know the power of the forces that assailed him or her. We also do not know what we would have done in the same circumstances. When we're looking at our brothers and sisters, when we're going into that natural inclination to judge somebody, we don't know their situation. And we struggle with things differently than someone else does. A sin that would make me fall won't be the same sin that would make you fall. And vice versa. So, instead of belittling and judging each other, we need to strengthen each other. If a sin that would make me fall wouldn't make you fall, that means I can strengthen you when you're tempted and you can strengthen me when I'm tempted. Instead of I can judge you when you're falling, and vice versa. Let's go ahead and read our verses. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is it not the source of your pleasures that are at war within your members? You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. So why do we fight? This is a very powerful question that James asks us. I feel that if we can understand it and apply it to our lives, then we will not only have better lives, but our church and our families will be healthier. James has a simple answer for us, But it's not the answer that we want. We want to hear that it's someone else's fault. But instead of that, James tells us what we already knew. He tells us that we are the problem. But instead of, he tells us that our desires are the problem. In the first part of the first verse, I have three different translations that kind of show us a little bit of the meaning. Don't they come from your passions? Or isn't it your desires battling inside of you? And don't they come from the cravings that are at war within you? It's our passions, our desires, our cravings. These are all things that are warring inside of us and warring inside of our body and inside of our families. It's the things that we want, that we desire, that the lusts and other things. It's the thing you saw in the commercial. The thing that Facebook is popping an ad up on. All these different little things that we want. And then when we get into a conflict about that, that's where a fight starts. When I hear my sons fighting, I'll hear them fighting in the family room, and I'll go in there and, all right guys, what's the problem? I am usually, I can't say always, but it's rare if it's not, usually greeted by these words. Well, I wanted, but I wanted to do this, but he isn't doing it. I wanted to play with that toy, but he's not sharing it. I wanted, but he. I think we do the same thing, don't we? All the time. We see it at work. I didn't want to work on that thing, but boss man made me do it. I wanted to use that tool. It's the same thing, but we justify it differently. Next time you get mad or upset at someone, think about why. Is it because you wanted something or to do something, but they didn't want to, or they messed it up, or they wouldn't let you? Think about it. This is a common problem that people have. But we change the words, or we get better at making it somebody else's fault. But deep down, if we look for it, we'll find that it's just that we want something and we're not getting it. In fact, I was looking at writing prompts and stuff, how to write a story, and they always said, one of the great ways to write a good story that will engage your audience is you have to think of this question. Somebody wants something badly and can't get it. That's your hero. They want something and they're trying to get it. Then your big bad evil guy is the one who's stopping them from getting it. And you can take most stories, break it down into that, and you have a great story. It's the same thing. They want, but somebody. So the next time you get angry at someone, just remember, I want it, but they won't let me. After that, James gives us some examples after that bombshell of a question. In James 4, chapter 4, verse 2. You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. Let's focus on that first part. You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. While James here doesn't specifically reference and call out King David, it's a very obvious parallel. It's the first thing that I thought of when I read this passage. Immediately, my mind was drawn to King David and Bathsheba, and I'm sure most of his readers thought the same. Let's go ahead and look at that real quick. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David the king sent his general and his servants, Joab, and all of Israel to go fight. So David already did something there that he wasn't supposed to. And they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and had her come to him. And when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said that she was pregnant. After this, I'm going to summarize the next 14 verses. David had Uriah the Hittite, her husband, come back and give him a report, and then said, "Oh, why don't you spend some time at home with your wife, now that you're here?" And he was a very loyal man, he wouldn't do it. So then he got him drunk and said, "Oh, now you go home." So he tried 3 different times to get Uriah to go there to cover up his sin, but it wouldn't work. So then, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he had written in the letter saying, "Place Uriah in the front line of the fiercest battle and withdraw from him, so that he may be struck down and die." So it was, as Joab kept watch on the city, that he put Uriah at the place where he knew there were valiant men. The men of the city went out and fought against Joab, and some of the people among David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. This fits James so perfectly that he might as well have quoted it. We can see that David wanted someone, and he was willing to murder to get her. This is David, the guy that God said was a man after his own heart. Yet, he's murdering over lust. You could even say that David said, "I want," but we need to guard ourselves so that we don't fall into the same trap. David was probably almost, without a doubt, across the board more of a man than me. He was stronger, he was probably wiser, he was closer with God than I was, yet he committed adultery and murder. So, when I read that and go, "Oh, I wouldn't have done that," I don't know. I don't know, like that quote said, what he was struggling with, how hard he tried to fight against it. So I don't know what I'm going to be faced with in the future either. The next part, I didn't have the verse here. The second part of that same verse, chapter 4, verse 2. You covet and you cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. If you can't tell, I love the stories of David and Solomon, because we're going to go right to a story about Solomon. And then, this is when, after Solomon had become king and was known throughout the land for being wise. And then 2 women came up as he was acting as a judge over the nation of Israel. 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "Oh my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. And it happened on the 3rd day after I gave birth that this woman also gave birth to a child. And we were together, and there was no stranger with us in the house, and only the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on it. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while I slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in mine. When I arose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, he was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is yours. But the first woman said, No, for the dead one is yours, and the living one is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. And then the king said, The one says, This is my son, and your son is dead. And the other says, No, for your son is the living, dead, and mine is the living. The king said, Get me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king said, Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him, because she is his mother. That's a great story about his wisdom, but also if we look at it through the lens of James, we can see that covetousness. My son died, so I'm going to steal yours. And she was unremorseful as well. Oh yeah, let your kid die too. It's just another picture into what we have inside of us. See if I wrote anything else down here. Yet another example of I want but she. I hope that you are seeing the pattern here. I'm trying to show it. Then we have James closing the passage with an interesting statement. James chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you can spend it on your pleasures. So James says that we don't have the things that we're fighting for because we're not asking for them. But just in case our next statement was going to be, but I am asking. I ask all the time. James has an answer. He tells us that we're asking for our wants, for the fleeting things, the fleeting desires that will make us temporarily happy, when we should be asking for the things that last, the things that have eternal results. We all want answers for what we can ask for, but instead of giving us a list, I would like to give us a lifestyle. What do I mean by that? I mean that just like the saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. I would like to give us a lifetime answer. I could search the Bible and get a list and take all the time to get everything that God definitely says is good that we should ask for, and that definitely says is bad that we shouldn't ask for, and put a list up here and we could write that list down. Okay, I'm only going to ask for these things. And that might help. It'd be a lot of work, and it would probably work for the most part. But if we can have a way to live that will almost guarantee those answers, wouldn't that be better? And this answer will not only answer this question, but it will bleed into other areas of our life to improve those areas as well. So here's my answer. Seek God. Get close to Him. And then ask Him whatever you want. It may seem simple, too simple. It may seem like I'm making a promise too big to back up. But if we seek God, strive to be near Him, strive to be like Him, and get closer to Him, establish that relationship with Him, we can honestly ask for anything. Because our desires will be so met up next to His that those will be the things He wants anyways. When we seek Him and put our lives on His path, our desires will line up with His. The things that we ask for will be the things He wants to do. They will also be the things that He wants to do for us and in us and through us. Think about birthdays or Christmas. Is it easier to buy a gift for someone that you know well, like your spouse or your children? Or is it easier to buy a gift for someone that you barely know, someone that you met last week? Sure, you might be able to get a decent gift for that stranger, a generic one that most anybody would need, but it won't be a personal, thoughtful gift like the one you can get for your family, for the one that you know much better. The same principle works for our walk with Christ. When we know Him and He knows us, we will be able to ask Him for bigger things and better things, and they will be answered. When I say bigger and better, I'm talking about biblical things. Biblical things. Our God is the same God who led the Israelites out of Egypt. He's the same God who knocked over the walls of Jericho, the same God who slew Goliath through David. He was still the same when He walked on water or when He raised Lazarus from the dead. And He didn't change when Jesus ascended into heaven. He was still with Peter when He healed the lame man at the gate. Peter was so in tune with God that at one point in his ministry, if his shadow touched someone, they would be healed. That's even more than what Jesus did when He was on the earth. Will you do these things? I don't know. Probably not. Healing isn't as powerful in America as it is in a third world country, as it was at the beginning of the church. And so God may not choose to work that way here. That's fine. I do know that our God hasn't changed. So then, whatever path He has you on, He is waiting for us to ask Him so that He can perform these miracles in our lives. Just get close to Him and ask. He tells us that if we ask, we can move mountains in His name. I don't think He's just using literary words there. I think He's being literal. If He has us on that path, and we're so tight with God that there's a mountain in our way, in between us and the mission that He has for us, and we ask Him, He'll move it. But we can't just be asking for things in vain. You know, He's not going to answer that request when I step out in front of a Mack truck and say, God, stop it. He'll say, it'll stop after He supplied the brakes and run you over. Now, if it was God's plan that I were to save somebody, run out in front of that truck and grab them and save them, and that person is the next Paul, and He chose to save me along with it, would He stop that truck? Yeah. He can, but He doesn't have to. He's not a genie. He's the creator of the universe. We can't treat Him like a genie. We need to treat Him like our Lord, who He is. So in closing, why do we fight? Nope. Oh well, that'll just play. I thought I had another slide. In closing, why do we fight? I want, but they. It's the things that we want that separate us. We let these little things get in our way, and they divide us. Instead, we should say, He wants, so I will. He wants, so I will. We need to focus on God's will, and everything else will fall in line. It may sound too simple, but try it for a week. Try it for this week. Every day in the morning, ask what He wants you to do. And whenever you don't know what to do or have some time, ask Him, God, what do you want me to do? I'm not saying He's going to boom out of the sky, I want you to go to Africa. But He will lead you. He will answer that question. I guarantee it. And then next Saturday, look back on this week. And you'll be surprised at what God did for you and through you. How your week was changed. I'd like to leave us with this story of something that a teacher did to avoid quarrels, and just a little thing, but it's an idea for us as well, and a reminder for us. One day, a teacher asked her students to list the names of other students in the room on 2 sheets of paper, leaving a space between each name. And then she told them to think of the nicest thing they could say about each of their classmates and write it down. It took the remainder of the class period to finish their assignment, and as the students left the room, each one handed in their papers. And that Saturday, the teacher wrote down the name of each student on a separate sheet of paper and listed what everyone else had said about that individual. On Monday, she gave each student his or her list. Before long, the entire class was smiling. "Really?" she heard whisper. "I never knew that I meant anything to anyone. And I didn't know that others liked me so much." These were most of the comments. No one ever mentioned those papers again in class. She never knew if they discussed them after class or with their parents, but it didn't matter. The exercise had accomplished its purpose. The students were happy with themselves and with one another, and the group of students moved on. Several years later, one of the students was killed in Vietnam, and his teacher attended the funeral of that special student. The church was packed with his friends, and one by one, those who loved him took a last walk by the coffin, and the teacher was the last to do so. As she stood there, one of the soldiers who acted as a pallbearer came up to her. "Were you his math teacher?" he asked, and she nodded yes. Then he said, "Mark talked about you a lot." And after the funeral, most of his former classmates were together on a luncheon. His mother and father were there, and they were obviously waiting to speak with the teacher. "We want to show you something," his father said, taking a wallet out of his pocket. "They found this on Mark when he was killed. We thought that you might recognize it." Opening the billfold, he carefully removed 2 worn pieces of notebook paper that had obviously been taped, folded and refolded many times. The teacher knew without looking that those papers were the ones on which she had listed all the good things each of Mark's classmates had said about him. "Thank you so much for doing that," his mother said. As you can see, he treasured it. All of his former classmates started to gather around, and Charlie smiled rather sheepishly and said, "I still have my list. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home." Chuck's wife said, "Chuck asked me to put his in our wedding album." "I have mine too," said Marilyn. "It's in my diary." Then Vicky, another classmate, reached into her pocketbook and took out her wallet and showed her worn, frazzled list to the group. "I carry this with me at all times." And she continued, "I think we all saved our lists." That's when the teacher finally sat down and cried. She cried for Mark and for all of his friends who would never see him again. Tell those that you love why you appreciate them while you still can. And think about good things to say and do for other people as we see them. Let's close in prayer. Lord, I thank you for this time. Thank you for this family that you've given us, that we can meet here and learn about you. Thank you for your promises for us and your love for us, Lord. Lord, I pray that the next time we want to say, "I want, but they," that you stop us. That you let us see what our anger, what our passions are doing, and that we can change that trajectory. and change it to you want, so I will. Lord, I pray that we will have a good week. You will keep us all in your hands, Lord, in your name. Amen. Thank you.